The cabin was quiet until a sharp slap shattered the air. An 8-year-old boy, flying alone for the first time, had dared to adjust his seat. What followed wasn't just an assault, it was racism in its rawest, ugliest form delivered by a man who thought he could get away with it. But he didn't know who the boy's father was, and he didn't expect the man sitting 3 rows back to stand up and change everything. Malik Johnson, an 8-year-old boy with a bright, inquisitive gaze and a spirit that rarely settled, found himself strapped into his window seat aboard Flight 737. The hum of the engines was a familiar lullaby, a comforting backdrop to the adventure that lay ahead. He was flying solo for the first time, an important milestone, to visit his grandparents. His parents, both busy professionals, had meticulously arranged everything, ensuring the airline staff were aware of his unaccompanied minor status. Malik, with his neatly braided hair and a slight gap between his front teeth, clutched a worn comic book, its pages crinkled from countless readings. He tried to focus on the vibrant illustrations, but his excitement buzzed like the aircraft itself. He occasionally shifted, a natural restlessness for a child confined to a small space, his foot tapping a light rhythm against the seat in front of him. Across the aisle, Thomas Griggs, a man whose tailored suit seemed to shrink with every passing minute of impatience, glowered, his face etched with a perpetual sneer, was already flushed from the pre-flight cocktails he'd consumed with aggressive enthusiasm. Griggs was a man accustomed to command, to silence, to spaces molded precisely to his comfort. The soft thrum of the aircraft, usually a signal of luxurious escape, was instead punctuated by the intermittent, innocent sounds emanating from the young boy. Each tap, each quiet rustle of the comic book, grated on his nerves like sandpaper. He had already sent 2 sharp glances in Malik's direction, glances that held a clear, chilling message of disdain. But the boy, absorbed in his world, had failed to register the unspoken threat. Griggs considered himself a master of subtle intimidation, but this child, this small black boy, seemed immune to his silent dictates. The flight had just reached cruising altitude when Malik, needing to stretch his small legs, gently pushed his seat back a fraction, a movement that barely registered as a tremor. The minor adjustment, however, was enough to unleash Thomas Griggs's simmering fury. His chair shifted abruptly, a violent jolt that echoed the sudden surge of his anger. Boy Griggs snarled, his voice a low, guttural growl that cut through the polite hum of the cabin. Malik startled, his wide, innocent eyes snapping towards the source of the sudden hostility. He pulled his seat forward instantly, his comic book slipping from his grasp to the floor, before Malik could even utter a word of apology or grasp the reason for the man's sudden outburst. Thomas Griggs lurched across the narrow aisle, his hand, heavy and swift, connected with Malik's cheek with a sickening thud. The sound was stark, undeniable, a sudden disruption in the placid cabin atmosphere. Malik reeled back, more from shock than pain, his small face stinging, his eyes wishten and glistening with unshed tears. A bright red imprint bloomed on his dark skin, a brutal testament to the unprovoked assault. The air in the immediate vicinity seemed to crystallize, the casual murmurs of other passengers dying down to an astonished silence. The immediate aftermath was a tableau of frozen horror. A flight attendant, pushing her refreshment cart down the aisle, gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Passengers in nearby rows, who had been engrossed in their tablets or half asleep, snapped awake, their heads swiveling towards the unfolding drama. Whispers, urgent and disbelieving, began to ripple through the cabin. Thomas Griggs, meanwhile, stood rigid, his chest heaving, a cruel satisfaction contorting his features. "That'll teach you to be quiet, you little brat," he spat, his voice thick with a venomous racial slur that was barely audible but instantly felt by those closest to the scene. The slur hung in the air, a poisonous cloud, solidifying the hateful intent behind the physical act. It wasn't just about noise, it was about contempt, about assumed What in God's name do you think you're doing, David Carter? A man of imposing stature with a sharp, intelligent gaze rose from his seat a few rows back. He had been quietly observing Griggs's aggressive demeanor from the start of the flight, a familiar sense of unease stirring within him. David had recognized Malik Johnson the moment he boarded, a striking resemblance to a dear friend from his past. A man he hadn't seen in years but whose presence had profoundly shaped his own career in law enforcement. David had seen the way Griggs had been looking at Malik, the simmering resentment in his eyes, and a primal warning had sounded in his mind. He had been about to intervene when the unimaginable happened. Now, David moved with purpose, his eyes blazing with a righteous fury that instantly commanded attention. He pulled out his phone, its camera lens already active, pointed squarely at Thomas Griggs. "I just recorded that whole thing," David announced, his voice clear and unwavering, cutting through Griggs's self-satisfied sneer. "Every single hateful word, every single moment of your disgusting assault." Griggs's face drained of color, his bravado instantly evaporating, replaced by a dawning realization of the catastrophic consequences of his actions. He stammered, attempting to formulate a denial. But no coherent words emerged. The immediate fear of legal repercussions, the sudden understanding that he had not only committed assault, but had done so in the full view of witnesses, including someone actively recording, washed over him. Malik, still trembling, looked at David, then back at the red mark on his cheek. The tears he had fought back now streamed down his face, a silent testament to the pain and humiliation he had endured. He wasn't just slapped, he was attacked for being himself, for existing in a space that someone like Griggs believed was not for him. The feeling of vulnerability, of being utterly alone in a crowded metal tube high above the earth, was overwhelming. David, seeing the child's distress, moved past the stunned Griggs and knelt beside Malik, his large hand gently resting on the boy's trembling shoulder. "It's okay, son," he said softly, his voice full of genuine empathy. "You are safe, and that man is going to pay for what he did." David's reassuring presence, his firm commitment to justice, began to chip away at Malik's immediate terror, offering a fragile sliver of hope in the suffocating aftermath of the assault. The cabin remained hushed, but the silence was no longer one of shock, but of anticipation. All eyes were on Thomas Griggs, a man now visibly shrinking under the collective, condemning gaze of dozens of strangers. He had made a grave miscalculation. The sting on Malik's cheek was fading, but the deeper ache of humiliation pulsed beneath his skin. David Carter's steadying hand on his shoulder was a beacon, yet it couldn't fully extinguish the familiar, chilling echo of past injustices. His mind, still reeling from the sudden violence, drifted back to a playground, a memory that had been carefully tucked away but now surged forward with unsettling clarity. He was 6 then, a whirlwind of boundless energy, chasing a brightly colored ball across the manicured grass. A group of older boys, their faces a blur of taunts and sneers, had converged on him. "Look at the darky trying to play with us." One had sneered, pushing him roughly to the ground. The ball, his prized possession, had been kicked away, rolling into a muddy puddle. Malik remembered the cold shock of the fall, the scrape on his knee, and the searing shame that had burned hotter than any physical injury. He had looked around, desperate for an adult, a friend, anyone, but the park was suddenly empty, the world narrowing to his small, helpless figure in the looming shadows of his tormentors. He had picked himself up, silent, retrieved his muddied ball, and walked away, the taunts echoing in his ears. His mother, when he recounted the incident, her face a mask of contained sorrow, had held him close. "Malik, sometimes people are unkind because of things they don't understand, or because they are scared," she had whispered, her voice heavy with the weight of generations of similar experiences. "It's important to be strong, to be wise. Your voice is powerful, but sometimes silence is a shield. Choose your battles, my brave boy. We can't let their ugliness define us." His father, a man of quiet strength, had added, always remember who you are, son, and always know that justice finds its way. But not every wrong needs your fist. Sometimes it needs your mind, your spirit, your endurance. Their words, meant to empower and protect, had subtly ingrained in young Malik a profound, if sometimes misguided, belief in the power of endurance, of choosing discretion over confrontation, of weathering the storm rather than actively fighting the wind. Another memory, sharper, more recent, clawed at his consciousness. It was at the local grocery store, just last year. Malik, with his grandmother, had been admiring a display of exotic fruits. An elderly white woman, her shopping cart laden with groceries, had brushed past them, her eyes narrowing as she took in Malik's presence. "Watch your hands, boy." She had snapped, her voice laced with suspicion, as if his very presence was a prelude to mischief. Malik, who hadn't touched anything, had instinctively pulled his hands behind his back, his grandmother's firm but gentle grip on his shoulder the only comfort. His grandmother, a woman whose wisdom flowed as freely as her laughter, had merely offered the woman a serene, almost pitying smile. Later, she explained, some people carry their pain, their fear, and their ignorance like heavy cloaks. Malik, they see what they expect to see, not what is truly there. It hurts, yes, but their darkness doesn't have to become yours. We don't have to engage every battle. Our dignity is ours to keep, no matter what others try to take from us. These lessons, steeped in love and the painful wisdom of Black resilience, had shaped Malik's understanding of the world. He understood that some battles weren't meant to be fought with the shouts or physical force, but with quiet strength, with the conviction that their inherent worth could not be diminished by another's prejudice. He learned to observe, to discern, and to trust that even in moments of perceived weakness, his true strength lay in his ability to endure, to not allow the venom of others to poison his spirit. He had learned to internalize the slights, to process them in the quiet corners of his mind, believing that reacting outwardly only validated the aggressor's power. It was a coping mechanism born of necessity, of survival, a silent pact he had made with himself in a world that often failed to see him as anything more than his skin color. This ingrained instinct for endurance, for a measured, quiet response, was why, when Thomas Griggs's hand had slammed into his face, Malik's first instinct wasn't to scream or lash out. It was to recoil, to absorb the blow, to internalize the shock, to look away, just as he had learned to do countless times before. His eyes, wide with disbelief in the sudden, sharp pain, had welled up not just from the physical impact, but from the shattering realization that even here, suspended miles above the earth, he was not safe from the casual cruelty of prejudice. He had felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the urge to retreat into himself, to become invisible, to make himself smaller. He had waited, almost instinctively, for the storm to pass, for the inevitable calm that followed the outburst. His tears were not just tears of pain, but of a deep, sorrowful resignation. He was an 8-year-old boy, but he carried the weight of ancestral lessons, the silent wisdom that sometimes, simply surviving was the most profound act of defiance. The shame he felt wasn't shame for himself, but the shame of witnessing such unbridled hatred directed at him for no other reason than his race. The physical blow was ephemeral, but the racial slur that accompanied it, the venomous disdain in Griggs's eyes, cut deeper, reopening old wounds. He had felt a familiar burning humiliation, the profound sense of being targeted, isolated, and diminished. But then, David Carter's voice had cut through the fog of his resignation, a voice not of quiet endurance, but of righteous anger, a voice that wasn't telling him to retreat, but to be seen, to be heard, to demand accountability. The sight of David's phone, recording a tangible piece of evidence, was a revelation. It was a direct contradiction to the lessons of quiet suffering. It was a new path, a path where the burden of silence was lifted, where the act of enduring was not the final answer, but merely a precursor to justice. For the first time, Malik saw a different kind of strength, one that actively confronted, that documented, that refused to let injustice fade into the silent annals of personal trauma. It was a shock to his carefully constructed worldview, a powerful jolt that challenged his ingrained coping mechanisms. David Carter wasn't just a stranger intervening, he was a catalyst, unknowingly offering Malik a glimpse of a different future, one where the whispers of prejudice were met with the roar of truth. The red mark on his cheek was a badge of Griggs's brutality, but David's presence, his unwavering gaze, transformed it into something else, a visible wound that demanded witness, a testament that could no longer be silently endured. He was not alone in this fight, and the world, for the first time, seemed to be watching. The moment the plane's wheels touched down, the cabin erupted, not in the usual relieved chatter, but in a sudden, palpable tension. The flight attendants, their faces etched with a mixture of shock and professional duty, had already radioed ahead. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, two uniformed airport police officers stood waiting at the jet bridge, their expressions grim. Thomas Griggs, his face now a sickly shade of gray, attempted a final, pathetic display of indignation, muttering about false accusations. But David Carter, his phone still in hand, stepped forward with an authority that had left no room for doubt. "Officer," David stated, his voice ringing with clarity, "this man assaulted an 8-year-old boy and used racial slurs. I have it all on video." He presented his phone, the chilling footage playing on its screen, a silent but damning witness. Without a word, the officers handcuffed Griggs, their movements swift and decisive, escorting him off the plane to a chorus of hushed gasps and a few audible murmurs of satisfaction from relieved passengers. Malik, still seated, watched the scene unfold, a strange mix of fear and a burgeoning sense of vindication washing over him. The red mark on his cheek throbbed, a vivid reminder of the brutal injustice. But seeing Griggs led away, shorn of his arrogant bravado, was a balm. When the aircraft finally emptied, a compassionate flight attendant stayed with Malik, offering him a warm blanket and a juice box, her eyes conveying silent apology for the terror he had endured. Soon after, his parents, Sarah and Robert Johnson, rushed onto the plane, their faces a frantic mixture of alarm and relief. Sarah, a lawyer known for her calm demeanor in the most challenging courtrooms, let out a choked sob as she pulled her son into a tight embrace, her fingers gently tracing the still visible bruise on his cheek. Robert, a man whose quiet strength belied a steel-trapped mind, knelt beside them, his jaw clenched, his gaze fixed on David Carter. "Mr. Carter," Robert began, his voice barely above a whisper, "we are eternally grateful. You did what so many others wouldn't have dared to do." David, a former federal agent now working as a security consultant, simply nodded, his eyes meeting Robert's with a shared understanding that transcended words. "He's a good kid." "Robert," David said, a hint of emotion in his otherwise composed voice. Couldn't let that stand. The revelation that David and Robert knew each other, that Robert was Malik's father, a high-ranking official within the Department of Justice, was a powerful undercurrent that would ripple through the ensuing investigation. It was a twist of fate that ensured this incident would not be easily dismissed or buried. As they exited the plane, the airport lounge buzzed with an unusual flurry of activity. News crews, alerted by anonymous tips and the rapidly spreading video, jostled for position. Flashes erupted, microphones thrust forward. Sarah shielded Malik's face, pulling him closer, while Robert, his arm firmly around his son, projected an air of quiet determination. A representative from the airline approached them, their smile plastered on, their demeanor stiff with practiced empathy. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, we are so terribly sorry for this unfortunate incident," the representative began, her voice dripping with corporate platitudes. We assure you, we are taking this very seriously. We've already moved to ban Mr. Griggs from flying with us again. And we'd like to offer Malik a complimentary first-class flight anywhere in the world, plus a significant travel voucher as a gesture of our deepest apologies. Robert's eyes narrowed. A travel voucher, he repeated, his voice dangerously low. My son was physically assaulted and subjected to a racist attack on your aircraft. This isn't about a travel voucher. Ma'am, this is about accountability and ensuring that such an act of hatred never happens again, especially not under your airline's watch. The airline representative's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. We are cooperating fully with law enforcement. Mr. Johnson, she insisted, a subtle shift in her tone betraying a hint of defensiveness. But these matters can be complex. We want to ensure Malik feels comfortable flying again. It was a thinly veiled attempt to minimize the racial aspect, to frame it as a mere unfortunate incident rather than a hate crime, a subtle form of institutional gaslighting. Meanwhile, David Carter's video, uploaded discreetly by a quick-thinking passenger who had received it via airdrop, had gone viral. It exploded across social media platforms, igniting a furious firestorm. The clip, stark and unedited, showed Griggs's lunge, the violent slap, and his hateful, mumbled slur, followed by David's calm, resolute intervention. Within hours, Thomas Griggs was not just an anonymous assailant, but a universally condemned figure. His company's stock plummeted, their phones ringing off the hook with angry investors and clients. Yet, amidst the widespread outrage, a disturbing undercurrent of resistance began to surface. Anonymous comments on news forums and social media posts, seemingly from nowhere, began to echo the airline's subtle deflections. He was probably just annoyed by a noisy kid. One comment read, "Kids today are so undisciplined. Who knows what he did to provoke it?" Another opined, "Why is it always about race? Maybe the guy just had a bad day." These insidious remarks, carefully phrased to avoid direct endorsement of racism while simultaneously absolving the perpetrator, were a chilling reminder of the systemic biases that lingered beneath the surface of society. Malik, nestled between his parents in the back of their car, scrolled through the news articles on his father's phone. The images of Griggs's handcuffed wrists and the flurry of headlines blurring into a kaleidoscope of unsettling information. He saw the video of himself being slapped, played repeatedly, each viewing a fresh jab of memory. He saw the hateful comments, the attempts to diminish his experience, to paint him as the instigator. He clutched his mother's hand. A newfound wariness etched onto his young features. His carefree spontaneity, once so vibrant, was replaced by a quiet vigilance. He flinched at sudden movements, his eyes scanning crowds with an unsettling alertness. He no longer tapped his foot rhythmically. Instead, he held himself still, almost rigid, as if preparing for another unseen blow. His parents noticed, their hearts aching. The world, which had seemed so large and full of wonder, had suddenly shrunk, revealing a darker, more dangerous corner he now had to navigate. The path to normal life was riddled with sharp, unseen edges, and Malik, despite the love and protection surrounding him, had begun to walk a different path, one shadowed by the indelible mark of prejudice. The days that followed were a blur of police interviews, media requests, and a constant, low thrum of anxiety that settled deep within Malik. The once boisterous 8-year-old was now a quiet observer, his eyes holding a wisdom beyond his years. He ate his meals silently, picked at his food, and spent hours in his room, staring out the window, occasionally sketching intricate designs in a new notebook his father had given him. His parents, heartbroken by the change, tried everything to coax him back to his former self. Sarah, usually immersed in her legal cases, took extended leave, her attention now solely focused on her son. Robert, despite the immense demands of his role at the Department of Justice, found himself working from home more often. His office transformed into a command center for Malik's emotional recovery. They sought therapy, enrolled him in new activities, and surrounded him with the unwavering love of family. Yet, despite their best efforts, Malik found himself frequently reminded of the incident, not always overtly, but in subtle, insidious ways. At school, some of his classmates, fueled by snippets of news reports and playground whispers, began to treat him differently. A few, inspired by the public outrage, rallied around him, offering awkward but earnest support. Others, however, seemed to absorb the subtle, often unconscious, biases that seeped into the collective consciousness. One afternoon, during a game of dodgeball, a boy named Kevin, usually a friendly rival, threw the ball with unusual force, hitting Malik squarely in the chest. "Oops, sorry," Malik, Kevin called out, but his eyes held a flicker of something unreadable, something akin to curiosity mixed with a vague unease, as if Malik was now an object of fascination rather than just a friend. Another time, during art class, a girl named Emily, usually effusive with her compliments, looked at one of Malik's drawings, a vibrant landscape filled with fantastical creatures. "It's good, Malik," she said, her voice strained, "but aren't you supposed to be drawing something else, like about what happened?" Her question, though innocent in its phrasing, implied a burden, a narrative expectation that Malik was now obliged to fulfill, to embody his trauma for public consumption. The most jarring encounters, however, occurred outside the protective bubble of his home and school. One sunny afternoon, while walking with his mother through a bustling shopping mall, an older white woman, pushing a stroller, suddenly swerved away from them, her hand instinctively tightening on her purse strap as she passed. The action was fleeting, almost imperceptible. But Malik saw it. He felt the cold sting of suspicion, the silent accusation in her averted gaze. Another time, at a local park, as he reached for the swings, a group of teenagers playing basketball stopped their game, their eyes following him as he approached. Laughter died down, replaced by a momentary, awkward silence. He heard one of them whisper, "Isn't that the kid?" The words weren't hateful, but the sudden shift in atmosphere, the way he became the focal point of their unspoken judgment, made him acutely aware of his changed status. He was no longer just Malik, he was that kid, the one who had been slapped, the symbol of a public spectacle. He started avoiding eye contact in public, his shoulders hunched, his naturally confident stride replaced by a tentative shuffle. Even more unsettling was the subtle, yet pervasive, societal pushback that began to manifest in various forms, while the overwhelming public sentiment was in support of Malik. A disturbing counter-narrative, fueled by anonymous online trolls and certain fringe media outlets, attempted to discredit him and his family. Stories emerged, fabricated and malicious, claiming Malik had a history of being disruptive, that his parents were opportunists seeking financial gain, that the entire incident was exaggerated for media attention. These whispers, though dismissed by mainstream media, chipped away at the edges of the narrative, feeding into existing biases and creating a hostile undertow. Malik's parents, through their legal team, fought back against these baseless claims, but the sheer volume of misinformation was overwhelming. One evening, Malik overheard a heated conversation between his parents. His father's voice, usually so controlled, was laced with frustration. "It's like they want to erase his experience." "Sarah," Robert said, pacing in their living room, "they want to make it about both sides, about nuance. When what happened was clear-cut racial violence, they're trying to dilute the impact, to make it palatable, to maintain the comfort of their own biases." Sarah sighed, her voice heavy. "It's the insidious nature of it, Robert. It's not overt hatred, but a quiet chipping away at the truth. They want to avoid confronting the uncomfortable reality of racism in plain sight." Malik, listening from the hallway, felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He understood, then, that the battle wasn't just against Thomas Griggs, it was against a more pervasive, often unseen enemy, the systemic reluctance to acknowledge and address racial injustice. It was during this period of quiet struggle that a small, unexpected act of defiance occurred. Malik, normally hesitant to speak about the incident, found solace in the presence of his pet chameleon, Rorschach. Rorschach, a creature of vibrant, shifting colors, had always been a source of fascination and comfort for Malik. One afternoon, while Malik was sketching in his notebook, the chameleon, perched on his shoulder, suddenly changed its colors to a brilliant, almost defiant red and black, the colors of his favorite superhero. A character known for standing up to bullies. It was a coincidence, perhaps a natural response to the light, but to Malik, it felt like a silent affirmation. He smiled for the first time in days, a genuine, unforced smile. He looked at the drawing in his notebook, a detailed depiction of the airplane, with Griggs's menacing silhouette looming over him. He had been about to crumple the page, to hide it away. But looking at Rorschach, a sudden spark ignited within him. He picked up a red crayon, then a black one, and began to add bold, defiant strokes to the image, not to obscure the pain, but to transform it into a symbol of resilience. He drew an invisible shield around himself, a vibrant aura of strength, and he drew David Carter, not as a blurry figure, but as a clear, strong presence, his hand outstretched, offering not pity, but empowerment. It was a small act, but in that moment, Malik was no longer just enduring. He was beginning to reclaim his narrative, one bold crayon stroke at a time, quietly turning his trauma into a testament of his own burgeoning strength. The date for Thomas Griggs' preliminary hearing arrived, a grim milestone that marked the official commencement of legal proceedings. The courtroom, a grand, intimidating space with high ceilings and dark wood paneling, was packed. News cameras were forbidden inside, but reporters thronged the hallways outside, their faces a mixture of anticipation and professional calculation. Malik, dressed in a crisp blue suit, sat between his parents, his small hand clasped tightly in his mother's. He had insisted on being there, a quiet, unyielding resolve in his eyes. He wanted to see justice unfold, to bear witness to the consequences of the man who had dared to diminish him. David Carter sat a few rows behind them, a silent sentinel, his presence a steadying anchor in the turbulent sea of emotions. Thomas Griggs, looking considerably less arrogant than he had on the plane, entered the courtroom, his once tailored suit now appearing rumpled, his face pale and drawn. He avoided eye contact, his gaze fixed on the floor, a stark contrast to the sneering disdain he had displayed on the flight. His lawyer, a slick, aggressive man with a reputation for merciless cross-examinations, immediately launched into a defense strategy that focused on discrediting Malik and minimizing Griggs's actions. He painted Griggs as a reputable businessman, stressed by travel, reacting impulsively to a disruptive child. He argued that the racial slur was either misheard or taken out of context, a product of heightened emotions. He even attempted to suggest that David Carter, by recording the incident, was somehow instigating rather than merely documenting, insinuating a manipulative motive. But then, the prosecution presented David Carter's video, the footage, projected onto a large screen for the entire courtroom to see, was chillingly clear. Every detail, from Griggs's aggressive lunge to the sickening slap, to his barely audible but undeniable racial slur, was laid bare. The gasps in the courtroom were audible, a collective intake of breath as the raw brutality of the act unfolded before them. The lawyer's carefully constructed narrative crumbled under the weight of the undeniable evidence. Malik watched, his chest tight, as his own image appeared on the screen, his 8-year-old self recoiling from the blow. He saw the red mark, felt the phantom sting. But this time, he wasn't alone. He was surrounded by his family, by David, by the silent, judging gaze of the courtroom. The shame he had felt on the plane was replaced by a quiet strength, a sense of power in the truth being revealed. Following the video, David Carter took the stand. His testimony was calm, precise, and devastatingly effective. He recounted the events with meticulous detail, his professional training evident in his clear, concise language. He described Griggs's behavior from the moment he boarded the plane, the simmering aggression, the hateful glances, and then the unprovoked assault. Under cross-examination, Griggs's lawyer tried to rattle him, to find inconsistencies, to imply malice. "Mr. Carter, are you perhaps exaggerating the severity of this incident for personal gain?" the lawyer probed, his voice dripping with insinuation. David met his gaze, unflinching. "I recorded a man physically assaulting a child and using racial slurs," he stated, his voice ringing with conviction. "There is no exaggeration needed. The video speaks for itself." The lawyer, visibly frustrated, could only retreat, his attempts to discredit the witness failing spectacularly. The emotional climax arrived when Malik was called to the stand. Sarah had prepared him meticulously, rehearsing his answers, ensuring he understood the gravity of the situation. He walked slowly, deliberately, towards the witness box, his small frame seeming to grow taller with each step. He took the oath, his voice surprisingly steady. He recounted the incident, his soft, childlike voice filling the large courtroom, drawing every eye. He described the fear, the confusion, and the pain. He spoke of the racial slur, how it made him feel small and wrong. His innocence, coupled with his clear, unflinching testimony, was a powerful counterpoint to Griggs's lawyer's cynical attempts to smear him. He spoke of his subsequent struggles, the subtle changes in his daily life, the way he felt watched, judged. He spoke of the fear, the anger, and the confusing sense of being singled out. Then, Malik spoke directly to the profound impact of the act, his voice gaining a quiet intensity. "Before that day," he said, his eyes meeting the judge's, then briefly glancing at Griggs, "I liked flying. It felt like an adventure. Now, it just feels like the beginning of something bad. And when he called me, that word, it made me feel like I was invisible, but also like everyone was looking at me, judging me, because of my skin." His words, devoid of artifice or adult manipulation, resonated deeply. He spoke of the subtle shifts in how he was perceived, how playground games now felt different, how some adults looked at him with suspicion. He recounted the whispers, the feeling of being that kid, the symbol. Rather than just Malik, his vulnerability, combined with his earnest desire for understanding, disarmed even the most hardened observers. The lawyer, sensing the shift in the courtroom's emotional temperature, kept his cross-examination of Malik brief and perfunctory, recognizing that any further attempts to attack the child would only backfire. As Malik stepped down, a profound silence descended, a moment of collective introspection in the wake of his simple, yet devastating testimony. The judge, a stern but fair woman, listened intently to all the testimonies. The weight of the evidence, particularly David's clear video and Malik's heartbreaking testimony, was undeniable. The legal battle over Griggs's charges of assault and hate crime, while still in its early stages, had clearly turned. Griggs's lawyer tried to pivot, arguing for a plea bargain, hoping to mitigate the damage, but the prosecution, emboldened by the strength of their case and the sheer public outrage, remained firm. The racial slur, the unprovoked nature of the attack, and the age of the victim were factors that would not be easily overlooked. The confrontation, though legal and structured, was climactic, not just for Malik, but for countless others who had suffered in silence. The courtroom became a crucible where quiet endurance met public exposure, and where the insidious nature of racial prejudice was brought into the harsh, unforgiving light of justice. The judge's gavel struck with a sharp, resonant crack, signaling the adjournment of the preliminary hearing and, implicitly, the undeniable weight of the evidence presented. The courtroom, which had been a crucible of raw emotion and stark legal arguments, instantly buzzed with a mixture of relief and palpable tension. Reporters, who had been scribbling furiously, now surged towards the exits, eager to break the latest developments. Outside, the news cycle had already begun to spin at a dizzying pace. Thomas Griggs, visibly shaken, was led away by bailiffs, his face contorted in a grimace of despair. The public spectacle of his arrest, his arrogant persona stripped away, was a stark image that flashed across screens worldwide within minutes. The immediate consequences for Thomas Griggs were swift and merciless. He was denied bail, deemed a flight risk and a potential danger given the public outcry. His mugshot, looking haggard and defeated, plastered across every major news outlet, became a symbol of corporate hubris colliding with racial injustice. The backlash against him was unprecedented. His company, already reeling from the initial stock plummet, now faced an exodus of clients and a mass resignation of employees. Partnerships dissolved overnight. Investments were pulled, and within days, his once thriving business empire was on the verge of collapse. His personal life also disintegrated. His wife filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and the public shame he had brought upon their family. Griggs, once a man who moved with impunity, found himself utterly alone, stripped of his power, wealth, and reputation. The community's response was a tidal wave, multifaceted and powerful. Initially, there was a surge of outrage, amplified by the viral video and Malik's poignant testimony. Online petitions demanding the harshest possible penalties for Griggs garnered millions of signatures. Hashtags like hashtag Justice for Malik and hashtag No Place for Hate trended globally, sparking conversations about racial bias and accountability in everyday interactions. Support poured in from Malik and his family, with messages of solidarity arriving from every corner of the globe. Schools organized assemblies on empathy and tolerance. Community centers hosted dialogues on racial harmony, and civil rights organizations intensified their efforts to combat systemic racism. However, beneath this wave of support, a more insidious counter-movement began to coalesce. Fueled by fringe media and online echo chambers, a narrative of cancel culture and reverse discrimination emerged. Griggs was portrayed by some as a victim of an overzealous public, a man whose life was being destroyed for a minor incident. Anonymous comments on forums and social media became more aggressive, accusing Malik's family of exploiting the situation for financial gain and questioning the authenticity of Malik's trauma. These voices, though a minority, were loud and persistent, attempting to sow seeds of doubt and dilute the impact of the incident. This segment of the population, threatened by the explicit exposure of racial bias, sought to reframe the narrative, creating a hostile environment for genuine dialogue. They engaged in doxing attempts against David Carter, publishing his personal information and sending him veiled threats, attempting to silence the brave witness. Malik's parents, despite their high-profile positions, also faced a barrage of online harassment, forcing them to increase their security measures. Yet, amidst this pushback, something profound began to stir within the larger community. The incident, rather than being dismissed or forgotten, became a rallying cry. Local activists, often working tirelessly in obscurity, found their platforms amplified. Grassroots movements gained unprecedented traction, demanding more robust anti-discrimination laws and increased awareness campaigns. There was a palpable shift in public discourse. People began to openly discuss the subtle forms of prejudice they had encountered. The microaggressions that often went unnoticed or unchallenged. The video of Griggs and Malik's brave testimony served as a mirror, forcing society to confront uncomfortable truths about its own biases. For Malik, the initial aftermath was a strange blend of public adoration and quiet vulnerability. He was hailed as a young hero, his face appearing in newspapers and on television screens, a symbol of resilience. Yet, the emotional toll was immense. He was still the quiet observer. But now his observations were sharper, more nuanced. He saw the genuine empathy in some faces, the calculated sympathy in others, and the underlying hostility in a few. He learned to discern between performative allyship and true solidarity. His parents, recognizing the immense pressure he was under, carefully managed his exposure, ensuring he had space to heal and process the overwhelming attention. One evening, as Sarah tucked Malik into bed, he asked, his voice barely a whisper, "Mom, why do they hate me so much?" Sarah's eyes welled with tears. "They don't hate you, my love," she said, stroking his hair. "They are afraid of what they don't understand, afraid of facing their own discomfort, afraid of change. But remember this, Malik, for every voice of hatred, there are thousands, millions, of voices of love, of support, of justice, and those are the voices that will win in the end." Her words, simple yet profound, offered a glimmer of hope in the complex tapestry of public opinion. The community, awakened by the raw truth of Malik's experience, was slowly but undeniably beginning to respond, not with a fleeting outrage, but with a burgeoning desire for meaningful change. The path ahead was long and arduous, but the seed of transformation had been planted, fertilized by the courage of an 8-year-old boy and the unwavering commitment of those who stood with him. The initial shockwaves from the incident gradually settled into a sustained hum of activism and awareness. Malik's story, amplified by his parents' thoughtful and strategic engagement with the media, transcended a mere news headline, becoming a powerful narrative that illuminated the pervasive nature of racial injustice. Sarah Johnson, leveraging her legal expertise and Robert's connections within the Department of Justice, meticulously guided their son's public presence, ensuring his narrative was told with dignity and purpose. They established the Malik's Voice Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to fostering racial harmony and supporting victims of hate crimes. Its mission was clear: to empower young people to speak out against discrimination, provide legal aid to those who couldn't afford it, and fund educational programs designed to dismantle implicit biases. The foundation quickly garnered significant public support, becoming a beacon for those seeking to challenge systemic prejudice. Malik, initially hesitant to step into the spotlight, found his voice through his art. His sketches, once private expressions of his inner turmoil, became powerful public statements. He began drawing murals, vibrant and impactful, depicting scenes of unity and resilience, often featuring figures with diverse skin tones holding hands or overcoming shadowed adversaries. One particularly striking piece, displayed prominently at a community center, showed a small boy with a determined expression, a bright shield of light radiating from him, deflecting dark, thorny tendrils. This mural, titled "The Unbreakable Spirit," quickly became an iconic image, a visual representation of the Foundation's core message. His art, devoid of overt anger but brimming with quiet strength, resonated deeply with people of all ages and backgrounds. It provided a visual language for the complex emotions surrounding racial injustice, allowing those who struggled to articulate their experiences to find common ground and solace. Digital platforms, which had once been a source of both support and subtle hostility, transformed into potent tools for Malik's message. The Malik's Voice Foundation launched a widespread campaign, encouraging individuals to share their own experiences with discrimination and how they chose to overcome it. This initiative exploded, creating a digital tapestry of shared vulnerabilities and collective triumphs. People from all walks of life, inspired by Malik's courage, posted heartfelt stories, videos, and artwork. Celebrities and public figures lent their voices, sharing their solidarity and further amplifying the message. The Foundation's online presence became a hub for resources, support groups, and calls to action, fostering a sense of community among those who had felt so isolated by their experiences. Malik, with his parents' guidance, occasionally participated in live online question and answer sessions. His calm, articulate responses further cementing his role as an unlikely but powerful advocate. He spoke not just of his own pain, but of the importance of allyship, of speaking up, and of finding strength in collective action. His natural charisma and genuine sincerity disarmed critics and galvanized supporters, pushing the conversation forward. The public impact was profound and multifaceted. The sheer volume of shared stories and expressions of solidarity created an undeniable momentum for change. Corporations, facing increased scrutiny from a newly awakened consumer base, began to review their diversity and inclusion policies, some even pledging significant financial support to organizations like Malik's Voice Foundation. Educational institutions, prompted by parents and students, revised their curricula to include more comprehensive lessons on civil rights and anti-racism, fostering a new generation of informed and empathetic citizens. There was a noticeable shift in public discourse, a greater willingness to acknowledge the uncomfortable realities of systemic discrimination. While overt hate crimes remained a concern, the incident and its aftermath had empowered individuals to challenge microaggressions and everyday biases more frequently, leading to a subtle but significant cultural shift. The public consciousness, once content to overlook or minimize instances of racial bias, was now acutely attuned to its manifestations, demanding accountability and fostering greater empathy. However, the path to rebuilding was not without its challenges. The sustained visibility also meant continued exposure to the vitriol of the counter-movement. Malik and his family received hate mail, veiled threats, and relentless online trolling. The attempts to discredit them persisted, fueled by individuals who felt threatened by the shift in racial power dynamics, by the uncomfortable truth his story exposed. Malik, despite his newfound strength, still had moments of quiet introspection, moments when the weight of the world felt heavy on his young shoulders. He sometimes struggled with the concept of forgiveness, wrestling with the lingering anger toward Griggs. His parents encouraged him to process these complex emotions, reminding him that forgiveness was a journey, not a destination, and that it was ultimately for his own peace, not for Griggs' absolution. The process of rebuilding was not just about public victory, but about deep, personal healing. It was about ensuring that Malik, the boy who had been unjustly slapped, could grow into a whole, resilient individual, unafraid to speak his truth and stand for what was right, not just for himself, but for generations to come. The scar on his cheek faded, but the mark of his resilience deepened, forging a spirit that was truly unbreakable, a testament to the enduring power of truth and courage in the face of hatred. Months turned into a year, then two, and the legal gears, though slow, ground inexorably towards their conclusion. The trial of Thomas Griggs was a media sensation, drawing global attention. The prosecution, spearheaded by a formidable team working closely with Robert Johnson's office, meticulously presented their case. David Carter's video, undeniable and searing, was the cornerstone. Malik's testimony, unwavering and delivered with a quiet dignity that belied his young age, captivated the jury and the public alike. The defense, despite their aggressive tactics, found themselves battling against overwhelming evidence in a tidal wave of public sentiment. They attempted to paint Griggs as a man driven to a momentary lapse of judgment, a victim of circumstance. But the malicious intent, underscored by the racial slur, was too clear to ignore. Finally, after weeks of intense deliberation, the jury returned its verdict guilty. Thomas Griggs was convicted of assault and a hate crime. The courtroom erupted in a collective whoosh, followed by a wave of hushed relief. Griggs, his face ashen, collapsed into his chair, his world irrevocably shattered. The judge, in her sentencing remarks, spoke with a stern voice about the abhorrent nature of racial prejudice and the need for accountability. She handed down a significant prison sentence, emphasizing that the punishment reflected not just the physical act, but the profound psychological harm inflicted and the chilling message of hatred it conveyed. Justice, in this instance, had been served, unequivocally. Griggs's conviction sent a clear, resounding message: acts of racial violence would not be tolerated, and those who perpetrated them would face severe consequences. The impact of the trial's outcome rippled far beyond the courtroom. It fueled a new surge of momentum for the Malik's Voice Foundation, the organization, now a powerful national entity, launched ambitious new initiatives. They partnered with educational bodies to develop mandatory anti-bias training programs for school faculty across several states, focusing on identifying and addressing microaggressions. They established a national helpline for victims of hate crimes, staffed by legal and psychological professionals, ensuring that more people had access to immediate support and justice. Donations poured in, allowing them to expand their reach, funding grassroots initiatives in underserved communities, and supporting independent journalists who were dedicated to exposing systemic inequalities. The media, once focused solely on the sensationalism of the trial, began to dedicate more airtime and column inches to discussions about systemic racism, implicit bias, and the long-term solutions required to dismantle discriminatory structures. The national conversation shifted, becoming more nuanced, more urgent, and more inclusive. 2 years after the incident, Malik Johnson stood on a brightly lit stage in a grand auditorium, a silent honor before an eager crowd. The city had organized a special Courage and Compassion Gala, honoring individuals who had made significant contributions to social justice. Malik, now 10 years old, had grown taller, his frame still slender but his posture straighter, more confident. His hair, neatly braided, framed a face that held both the lingering innocence of childhood and the deep wisdom of a survivor. Beside him stood his parents, beaming with pride, and David Carter, his presence a quiet testament to their enduring bond. The mayor, a woman known for her progressive policies, introduced Malik, her voice thick with emotion. "Tonight," she announced, "we honor a young man who, through his extraordinary courage and unwavering spirit, turned a moment of pain into a beacon of hope for us all." As Malik approached the podium, a thunderous applause erupted, a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. He looked out at the sea of faces, a mix of dignitaries, community leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens, all united by his story. He saw children his age, their eyes wide with admiration. He saw adults, some with tears in their eyes, acknowledging the silent battles they, too, had fought. He took a deep breath, clutching the microphone, his small hand dwarfed by its size. His initial shyness, a vestige of his trauma, had given way to a quiet determination. He remembered the feeling of being invisible, the sting of the slap, the whispers that tried to diminish him. But he also remembered David's unwavering gaze, his parents' boundless love, and the vibrant colors of his chameleon. Rorschach, a silent reminder of his own resilience. 2 years ago, Malik began, his voice clear and strong, resonating through the hushed hall. "A man tried to make me feel small. He tried to make me feel like I didn't belong. He tried to hurt me because of the color of my skin." A collective murmur swept through the audience, a shared acknowledgement of the raw truth. But he didn't know. Malik continued, his voice gaining power, his gaze sweeping across the faces, that for every person who tries to push you down, there are so many more who will lift you up. He didn't know that my parents taught me strength, and that Mr. Carter taught me that silence is not always the answer. He paused, his young eyes holding a profound understanding. What happened to me was wrong, and it hurt. But it also showed me how many good people there are in the world. It showed me that when we stand together, when we speak up, when we demand kindness and respect for everyone, things can change. He looked at his parents, then at David, a small, grateful smile touching his lips. "My scar," he said, gently touching his cheek, "is a reminder of what happened. But it's also a reminder that I am strong, and it's a reminder that we all have a voice. Use your voice, not to hate, but to heal. Use your voice to stand up for others. Use your voice to build a world where everyone belongs." His words, simple yet profoundly powerful, hung in the air, a clear, resonant message of hope and unwavering resolve. The applause that followed was deafening, a cascade of gratitude and shared commitment. It wasn't just an ovation for a brave boy, but a collective affirmation of a shared future, one where justice was pursued relentlessly, and where the darkest acts of hatred were met with the brightest light of human compassion. Malik Johnson, the boy who was slapped, had transformed his pain into purpose, becoming an enduring symbol of resilience, and leaving behind a legacy of courage that would inspire generations to come.